It's time for another book review. I've taken a little bit of a hiatus just due to a lot high volume at work. So I apologize for that. I'm back to it. I'm going to try to do a few tonight on some of the classics, as it were. This is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. And this was originally published, I believe, in 1932. Yes, 1932. This edition is from 1992, but originally, and it's important to know when that came out because this was in the early days of when eugenics still was kind of in a positive, seen in a positive light in a lot of circles here in the United States. It wasn't until, of course, after Nazi Germany, tarnished the image of the eugenics movement that it kind of took a step back behind the curtain. But this is a very interesting book, and I'm curious, those of you who've read Brave New World, I would love for you to chime in on this one because the story, now this predates George Orwell's 1984, but very similar. And reading this, I'll try to do this review without any spoilers in here, but he spends the first, I would say 4 or 5 chapters or so, really establishing the culture of this future society that he's talking about. And many of you, that alone, and especially knowing that this dates back to 1932, will find this fascinating. A lot of the transhumanist movement is really bottled up, quite literally, in the beginning of this book. And what that is, he talks about humans in the future in this, I think he talks about it, everything is dated by the birth and death of Henry Ford. And Ford is treated like a deity in the future, and they've modified crosses, take the top off to make it a T, and they do the sign of a T is for Ford. And anyway, so it's 632 AF after Ford is when this takes place. So one of the things he spends considerable time on in the beginning is it starts in the breeding facility for humans and explaining to the audience here that this concept of motherhood and fatherhood is really seen as kind of a crass, and it's even used as a slur to call someone a mother or father is really, really bad. But in this future world, people are grown in bottles, and they're ultimately, instead of birth, they're decanted. And depending on what strata of society they're going to be in, they're bred for various classes. And he really bears down on this point of how important it is that you need all these different strata of society. You need these lower working caste to do these jobs that they don't like, but they're bred so that the lower caste enjoys their servitude at that level. And he even goes so far as to explain that some of these lower castes are bred specifically deprived of oxygen, so they are stunted mentally and accept that role, that they're basically mentally challenged just enough that they can do their job but not think too much. And then there's certain castes that are deliberately given alcohol in their synthetic womb so that they are also stunted in their own ways. So very interesting that this knowledge, this whole idea, this concept of breeding different castes goes back to at least 1932, probably before that. Now, the main thing I wanted to discuss in this review and that I wanted to engage this audience with is the question that hung over my head through the whole book, and especially at the end is really kind of convoluted, is whether or not Aldous Huxley intended this as a warning or as something of a blueprint for how he thought things should be. Because when you read this, he's very careful to make it so he could kind of back out of it and go either way. He doesn't really commit to either side. And the protagonist in this is a savage who grew up outside of this, kind of outside the matrix, so to speak. And when the savage character is introduced, a lot of you, if you've read this book, will probably, and if you read it now, your initial reading of that will be that, oh, the savage is going to be the one that is kind of the right-headed individual. And the way he's portrayed is really curious because he kind of makes a mockery of all of the good things that the brave new world is getting away from. So there's not really a sympathetic character that you could really latch onto and be like, okay, yeah, that I can see myself in that guy. So that's a little frustrating. And part of me, about 3/4 of the way through, and I had a couple of customers come through that had read this, that I posed this to, and I said, it really makes me wonder the way he depicts some of these characters and their interactions, if he was such a warped individual that he did not have a fair understanding of human interaction, because he sure can't convey it. Even when he's trying to convey it in some of these characters, you think this dude was either really mixed up and had a really poor understanding of human interaction, or that was his point. And again, that's one of those things, all the way up into the end, I found myself really wondering, what's his angle? What's he really trying to say? But I think that was kind of the point of, he was kind of hiding behind this noble ambiguity of, hey, I'm not really taking a side. I'm just presenting this future world how it could be. So some of that's kind of frustrating, because you want, by the end of it, you really want there to be some resolve to this, or some angle that kind of corrects this, but it's never really provided. So interesting book overall. I think the story is, it's in this era now where we've seen so much post-apocalyptic and dystopian novels, that this format now, and sadly it's kind of become a template for so much stuff out there, has been so overdone that it's really hard to kind of retreat back to, circa 1932 and see it the way that audience saw it. But like I said, I still think there's a lot of merit in looking at it through those eyes. It's just very difficult to do that. I had started to read this in high school, but by the time I was in senior English, this had actually been removed from the curriculum. And I asked some of my peers, and very few people read this in high school, which is kind of surprising, because I think my older brother and sister actually read this. So again, very fascinating look at the kind of origins of the transhumanist movement. I'm not saying Aldous Huxley is the architect of that, but he definitely does a good job of summing that all up. And it's obvious that he had been around people who were speaking in these terms. But when you hear the way he describes all this, it's obvious that he was knee deep in that, or around those people talking about that. And I also find it interesting that he refers to the upper echelons that are watching over this as the controllers. And probably the most damning thing about his whole narrative is it's all presented, even the flaws and all the warts of this future society are presented as just really kind of the side effects of them really trying to be good and do good for society. So there's never a malevolent intention ascribed to anyone. And that, again, that kind of makes you wonder, okay, what exactly is your angle here? Because anyone who's researched the eugenics movement, people like Margaret Sanger, who notoriously said the quote about getting rid of the inferior Negro race, knows that the eugenics movement was full of some very twisted, very dark people, and they were not saints by any stretch of the imagination. But very interesting look into that, especially knowing this came out in 1932 and kind of seeing the way the eugenics movement went after all that is really curious. And again, I'd love to hear some of you who've read this. I'd love to hear your take on what you think of Aldous Huxley and what he was trying to say with this book, because some of it is really, again, kind of like I've talked before in previous videos about something called a Barnum statement that's used by fake psychics, where you say something very ambiguous and it includes all the elements of things people like to hear, and they will take what you say and assemble it into something that they wanted to hear. So you can say even conflicting information, and they will kind of run it through their mental strainer, and they'll come away with what they want to have. And that's kind of the idea you get with some of this is, if you want to see this as a warning, that's what you're going to see. If you want to see this as a template for how society should be, then that's what you're going to see. So really both are there, and it's up to you as to what you take away from it. But overall, a very interesting piece of that dystopian puzzle, and knowing again that there seems to be now seeing a lot of the transhumanist movement where that's moving, and seeing how much of this is in line with what he said in 1932. It really does make you wonder what exactly this Aldous Huxley knew, and how much of this was kind of predictive programming or what have you. So I will wrap it up there, but that is Aldous Huxley's Brave New World from 1932.